another episode of The Plunge. And we just came off an insane night in Denver, was it? Against Washington. And for those of you who did not watch the game, I suggest you go back to the last 30 seconds of that game in the last possession. So we're going to start off there with our quick hitters today. So basically Jamal Murray at the ball, like with 3 seconds left. 3 guys on the wing, 3 Nuggets on the wing. Michael Porter Jr., Facundo Campazzo, and Monte Morris. All of them stood at the 3-point line, and none of them cut. They were down 2, 3 seconds to go. None of them cut. Jamal Murray throws a pass to Campazzo, which was greatly contested, and it was a brick. And the Nuggets lost the game 112-110. So Nate, what is your reaction to this play? This huge choke by the Nuggets?
It's interesting to me because you have 3 guys on the perimeter. One of them, and Michael Porter Jr., just known to make bad decisions. Like, just not a high IQ player for the most part. Super talented, but he hasn't really figured things out in the NBA so far. And the other 2 guys, you have Campazzo, who's a rookie, but he's 32 years old, and Monte Morris, the reliable backup point guard, who's been one of the best backup point guards in the league for the past while. It was such a crazy play to me. It partially speaks to the modern NBA, but it also shows you why this Denver team has struggled this year, because they just live and die by that 3 ball. Their players don't make the correct plays. They're all trying to play hero ball. And it just feels like they continue to come up short in some way, and it's going to be an issue that they have to work out through the rest of the season. So moving on from this, we have Russell Wilson back in the news again today. There were talks of him storming out of a meeting in the middle of this season when they kind of went through that offensive rut. And he's been talking about getting a trade. He says he's happy in Seattle right now, but it seems that tensions are boiling over. So Russell Wilson says he's happy in Seattle, but lists 4 teams: the Bears, the Cowboys, and the Bears, the Cowboys, the Saints, and the Raiders as possible destinations for a trade. What are you thinking about all this Russell Wilson business?
It's unfortunate for sure. I think it'll really boil down to what the Seahawks will do in their offseason acquisitions. And when you listed those teams there, I don't want them to go to the Cowboys. I really don't want First Take spending all of their airtime, their 2 hours each day talking about the Cowboys. I'm so tired of them talking about the Cowboys right now anyway. So if he goes to the Cowboys, it's game over. I really don't want to watch them play. But even then, it really depends on where Dak Prescott's going to go too, and even just the tensions between him and the front office there in Dallas. So that's a very interesting headline to keep an eye on amidst the Russell Wilson trade rumors. And I think, I don't know, the Raiders, Bears, they seem like solid teams that could take him on. Even the Saints, and I think there's been debate whether Taysom Hill is going to be the starting quarterback this season, or even Jameis Winston. So I don't know. There's a lot of different options for this. But it'll be very interesting to keep an eye out for them. So, college basketball. I haven't been watching too much ball in college, but Nate has been, and I think Michigan State and Duke have had some big wins. I know Jalen Johnson opted out of the season, and they actually have a better record without him on the floor. So Duke had some big wins, I think against NC State the other day, or the other week, I forgot. But what are your thoughts, and are you excited for the upcoming March Madness?
Well, Duke beat out my team, the Orange, on, I think it was Tuesday night last week. And that was kind of a 2 teams in the bubble play-in game almost, because after that loss, Syracuse isn't looking like they'll make the tournament without a strong showing later on. But it's so interesting to me how Duke at 11-8 and Michigan State at 12-9 just suddenly catapult above almost every other team with a record of 15-10 or whatever it is. As soon as you hear the name Michigan State and Duke on the bubble, it's everyone is going to vote to have them in the tournament, just because this year has been so lacking in blue bloods. If Michigan State and Duke didn't make these runs, it would be a year where Duke, Michigan State, Kentucky, and North Carolina all didn't make the tournament, which hasn't happened since I've been alive. And I'm sure that that combination of those four teams has all been a 1 seed in the same year. And so it's just been a fall of great teams, but these guys who are picking for the tournament for the at-large bids are trying to keep some blue bloods in there. So I think even if Michigan State and Duke have a worse record than some of the other teams, it'll be interesting to see how they react to, one, the recency bias of how good these teams have been recently, and then two, the history bias of it's Duke and Michigan State. So we'll see how this goes, and we'll be ramping up our discussion about college basketball probably as we head into the tournament later this month or next month. Sorry. But moving on from that, reactions to All-Stars. So today we had the breaking news that Sabonis will be in for Durant. Yesterday it was Booker subbing in for AD. My question to you is, how did these picks surprise you, and who are the biggest snubs left off these teams still?
Well, I don't think the Sabonis thing was a really too big of a surprise. Just because if you have Nikola Vucevic in the All-Star team, you should have Sabonis as well. He's just as good as him. He's just as versatile as a big man as Vucevic and even Embiid and all those guys. That's not too big of a surprise there. In terms of the East, I think you do have some snubs. Like I'm thinking about Chris Middleton, Zach LaVine, Fred VanVleet. But when you think about it, you have to do the simple math where if you think this guy should be in the All-Star team, who do you want to take out? And I think the person I would take out from the East is Jason Tatum, because he's been out for a while with COVID and he really hasn't looked the same. But I think just because and also Boston's they're under 500 right now, and so that kind of takes a little bit off his reputation this season, and totally Sabonis deserves a spot over Tatum in my opinion. But when you look at guys like Zach LaVine, the Chicago Bulls are 7th in the Eastern Conference as of today. I think they're ahead of Boston right now. And when you look at that, when you look at that, you're like, man, Zach LaVine's such a better player than Tatum. But he's on the All-Star team, so really don't want to talk too much about him. But yeah, when you look at Chris Middleton, sure, he could have been on the team because he's in the Bucks and they're a better record than them. Let's turn it over to the West. What are your thoughts on Devin Booker replacing AD and any surprises or snubs from that team on the West?
The amount of people who came out and openly were like, Devin Booker should have been on this team. Like LeBron was like, Devin Booker should have been on this team. The only person who I could have seen be left off of the West roster was AD, and I don't think LeBron was campaigning for AD to be left off that roster, and it's one of those situations where it's clear to everyone who has actually watched the Phoenix Suns this year that Chris Paul is the reason that they've been so good this season. Yep. And sure, Devin Booker's putting up like 24, 5, and 5, but don't get history twisted with what's happened this season. And I'm happy that he made it. Although I still think that the Spurs with no All-Stars in 5th, and then, of course, that was on the Eastern side, too, with Indiana not having an All-Star being 4th in the conference. But it's always questionable to me when you're putting in 2 guys from the Suns or 2 guys from Boston. The Suns have been good this year, but it seems to me that you're not bringing in all the markets just based on what the history of Devin Booker is compared to how DeMar DeRozan is playing this year. And he's really helped that team get into the playoff race this year. So I was surprised about DeMar not getting in, not even really being mentioned. And then out East, I think Trae Young left off the roster is interesting just from a statistical standpoint, but not really something that I'm too torn up about because the Hawks haven't been as good as advertised yet this season.
Yeah, I think Trae Young's a bit overrated to me, just because he doesn't play defense. His athletic frame doesn't allow him to play any defense. But yeah, when you talk about Booker, he's more of a one-dimensional player right now, where he has this huge repertoire in his offensive game, but he really hasn't stepped into that playmaking role this year. And you could say Chris Paul has of course taken the bulk of that responsibility. And when you look at their success this year, like I agree, Chris Paul has been the bigger reason of success over Devin Booker, just because he's way smarter than anybody on the floor, and he just has that wealth of experience, and even just brings a better skill set defensively compared to Booker. But so got the quick hitters out of the way. We're gonna talk about Washington and Boston, but first we're just gonna take a quick ad break. Okay, so we are going to talk about the Washington Wizards. They deserve a lot of attention. They've won 6 straight games. They just came off a huge West Coast road trip. They're in the middle of a 5-game week this week, and they just beat the Nuggets. And so they're winners of 6 straight. Bradley Beal's balling, of course. Russell Westbrook is averaging a triple-double almost. And so what are the chances of this team making a playoff push this season?
Yeah, I think they've won 6 of 7. They had a loss to the Clippers before that Denver game, but when this season started, they were a plus 110 bet to make the play-in game, which I thought was the freest money in all of sports betting, because how could you not make a play-in game when you have Westbrook, who is great every regular season, and Bradley Beal, who averaged 30 last year, and that didn't come to fruition in the early season. They struggled because of role players playing bad. Russell Westbrook averaging more turnovers than points. Just a lot of factors didn't mesh with this team early, and that their early record didn't really indicate what this team is capable of, or what they had in talent, and possibly what their role players could be doing to assist beside Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook. And now you're kind of seeing this team mold into that. Russell Westbrook is the main point guard, but he's leaning more towards distributing this year. Bradley Beal's putting up 33 to 35 a game. They have guys like Wagner, who's starting now, who's playing big minutes, who's played well. He can shoot the 3. He really stretches the floor well for a big man, and he's pretty versatile. And then just kind of inserting shooters in there too. Garrison Matthews, who really is a nobody before this year. And then Davis Bertans, who the Latvian laser. I mean, he had a slow start to the season, but he was going to pick it up eventually. I think this Washington team is competitive. I think they're better than a team like Charlotte, who's in the playoffs right now, who isn't a bad team, but you have so much proven talent between that backcourt of Beal and Westbrook. I don't see a way in which they fall back to what they were doing in the early season. I see them making a push for that 8 seed. They're not even far out of that 8 seed right now, just because of how weak the Eastern Conference has been so far. So I see them making a push for that 8 seed, coming over teams like Chicago, New York, and Charlotte in that kind of 10 through 8 region.
Yeah, like when you look at the standings right now, it's pretty jam-packed from like 4 to 12, and Washington is currently 12th, and they're behind teams like what you said, Atlanta, Chicago, Charlotte, and you'd expect Chicago and Charlotte to kind of fall off, and the NBA released the second half of the schedule, and I think that's a very important thing to keep an eye on, because you have Russell Westbrook, who's a bit prone to injury. He has played some back-to-backs actually pretty recently, so I think looking at his health is going to be a very interesting storyline, because there's going to be a bunch of back-to-backs, a lot of play every other day kind of schedule, just because the schedule is so jam-packed. And yeah, like you said, there's a bunch of no-names on this team that is getting meaningful minutes, like Garrison Matthews. Rui Hachimura is actually having a really good season. He scored 20 points against the Nuggets yesterday. I think he's actually starting to mold into very, very good power forward in that 4 spot. But yeah, I think the only problem with them is just losing Thomas Bryant. They don't really have a solid 5 guy. Like, I think, Robin Lopez is good. Wagner's pretty good, but like you can't really depend on any of them to play 32, 33 plus minutes. But I don't even know if that's even too big of a problem when you can stagger their minutes and when you have a guy like Westbrook who brings that defensive intensity. But yeah, I think they're doing really well. They're in really good shape. They're sharing the ball a lot. Bradley Beal's getting a lot of his touches. So yeah, but what are your thoughts about the second half of the season impacting their health?
It's interesting to me. They were planning to sit Russell Westbrook on back to backs all season, from what Scott Brooks said at the start of the year. And then as soon as they were like 3-11, I was like, okay, they're going to sit Russell Westbrook until they get on a win streak, because you can't sit a guy like Westbrook back to backs just because he won't. He won't sit back to backs if they need to win, right? And he is going to push himself to play every single night pretty much as they get back into that playoff race in the Eastern Conference. And yeah, that could lead to some bad things. Although he has played healthy a lot of seasons. Like last year, for most of the season, he was pretty healthy. I mean, the Rockets tried to manage him during the season in some ways, but he had those years in OKC playing 82 games. Before that, his first injury in the playoffs when Patrick Beverley took him out that one time, he was the NBA's leading player in consecutive games, and he's just a high motor guy, wants to play every game. Bradley Beal has never been a guy to sit because he plays in more of a methodical way where he's not destroying his body every time he's out there. He kind of picks and chooses his spots to attack. And I'm not scared of the back-to-backs because most of the back-to-backs are scheduled at home. Most of the teams they tried to work the NBA schedule, so if you're playing a back-to-back, you're sleeping in your own bed. You're not traveling that night kind of thing. And so that's where it becomes like, yeah, there's a worry to it, but it's not your regular, I'm in LA and I'm going to fly to Boston to play the next day.
Right.
You're playing in Washington one night and you're playing in Washington the next night. So I do think that this team will have a full roster playing for a long time. One thing that's kind of funny to me is these teams who get COVID early on. Washington had problems, Philly had problems, and you kind of get it out of the way for your team in some ways. I mean, you build up some immunity to it, and then the dumb guys who were out and partying or whatever it was that brought it to your team are immune to it. So, or they're either immune to it or they got in so much trouble the last time that they haven't done it again. So that's where I feel a little bit safer about some of these teams in terms of COVID health wise. And I just think that the continuity of playing with a full roster will help Washington in the second half of this season.
Yeah. I think another thing that would help them is that they're 23rd in strength of schedule for the rest of the games this season. So that's pretty good. And when you look at teams like Chicago, they have the 7th hardest schedule, and the Knicks have the 13th hardest schedule. So when you have Washington down at that 23 spot, like you're put in a pretty good position. And even looking at, and Miami has an easier schedule than them, but Miami is Miami. They'll make it into the playoffs for sure. But yeah, any other last thoughts about this Wizards team, or we can move on to Boston if you want?
Yeah, we'll move on to Boston from here. So the Celtics have lost 4 in a row. They've fallen under 500. What's a problem with this team that has so much talent and has such young studs throughout their roster? And is Stevens on the hot seat, and should he be on the hot seat?
Well, okay, let's start with Brad Stevens. I don't think he's in the hot seat at all, just because he's such a high caliber coach. He's one of the best coaches out there, and when you're the other 29 teams in the NBA and you're looking at this, and when you think Brad Stevens is on the hot seat, you're thinking like, oh my goodness, if you're on a team whose coach is on the hot seat, like we should take Brad Stevens. Like it's a no brainer. And when you get into that thought of taking Stevens as a head coach for your team, that means you shouldn't even give him up if you're Boston. Like there's no way that you really let go of this guy who has been to 2 or 3 Eastern Conference Finals in the past 5 years, and and it was coached one of the best duos in the league with Tatum and Brown and their development. Like, come on, you got to really stop with the talk about Brad Stevens. And because of that, I think the more real problem on the court problem is them sharing the ball. And like they're I think 28th in the league in assists per game with 22.1. And when you look at them play, like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum really just get into ISOs. like and Kemba Walker has been really so bad this season, and understandably so because of his knee injuries. But not having Marcus Smart in this stretch, that really has kind of hurt them on the defensive end. But even on the offensive end, like they're not moving the ball at all. They don't even have the competent guys to create that ball movement when you play Tristan Thompson and Daniel Tice on the floor at the same time. Like they will not catch the ball and shoot spot up threes from the corner at the end of the shot clock, right? They're not going to make those shots. And so I think the biggest problem is just moving the ball. But they are in a really scary spot right now.
Yeah, your comments about Brad Stevens, I agree. You don't fire a coach like that, but I don't know if Danny Ainge sees it that way. Like, you could look this season, the Philadelphia Eagles, after making the playoffs 3 straight years, winning a Super Bowl, having one bad year, and all of a sudden, Doug Peterson, he gets fired, and it's just like, it makes no sense because how many successful years you've had, but sometimes GMs will get in mind that the coach has lost the locker room in some way, and that's not an indictment of the coach's ability. Like Brad Stevens, I would say he's like a top 5 coach in X's and O's in the NBA. Maybe Greg Popovich, number 1. Doc Rivers is up there somewhere. Quinn Snyder, underrated, but he's been a really good coach for the past while. But that's where you look at a guy like Stevens and you're like, yeah, he would get a job right away if he was fired from Boston. There's no question about that. He would go and coach. There are 20 teams in the NBA who would drop their coach right now and take Brad Stevens if they could. But when you are struggling as a team and you have 2 young guys who are your future, you're not going to pin it on, oh, Jason Tatum this or Jaylen Brown that. Yeah, sure, you can pin some of that on Kemba if you want because his future there is a little bit more murky. Like, maybe he's a regressing player, maybe injuries have caught up with him. Who knows? But it's usually easiest to pin it on the coach. And if that team continues to struggle, it would be the easiest thing to do to fire Brad Stevens, in my opinion, if you're Danny Ainge and you want to show your fan base that you're kind of taking into account what's going on with these losses or this lost season if it ends up translating to the full season, which I don't think it will, because Marcus Smart is one of my favorite players in the league just because he brings so much intensity and he's a very underrated playmaker. Like, you didn't hear people talking about his playmaking abilities before this whole catastrophe with Boston recently. And then everyone wants to say, oh yeah, Marcus Smart is the best playmaker in the league. Like, yeah, that's not true. He is a really good playmaker though, and that didn't have enough attention brought to it beforehand. And obviously he's a motor for their team in a lot of ways. But Boston is going to continue to struggle if Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum keep the ball in their hands. Like, it's like you almost have 2 guys out there who take after Kobe in some ways. Like, their inspiration is from Kobe, and there's a reason why Kobe never succeeded. There's a reason why Kobe always succeeded.
Right.
Because he didn't have another Kobe on the team. Because you can't get into a rhythm if you have to play ISO sets every time down and you're sharing it with another guy. Like, I don't know if Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum can find a way to succeed together because they're both great players. They're both top 5 wings for the next 10, 15 years if nothing catastrophic happens to their careers. But maybe you start to shop Jaylen Brown a little bit and see what you can get for a defensive player or a defensive-minded player who brings a lot to your team in terms of leadership. And I don't know, like, I I don't have a perfect candidate who you could trade for at this point, but maybe Jaylen Brown, it might be time to shop him just because he is so valued around the league. He is an all-star. He is probably, if the season ended right now, he might make third team All NBA. That's how good he's been this year.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, as if you're, I think Celtics fans would really be mad at you for making that take. I think the narrative around the Celtics right now is that Tatum and Brown are the duo of the future, and a lot of NBA GMs would love to have a team with those guys on, like, carrying the roster, right? But I think a comparison that you can make with that duo, you can make it with the Blazers with Dame and CJ. The way that they move the ball, or the way that they distribute the scoring between the two of them, it's like, I think in their offense, Dame has the ball and he calls for pick and roll, whatever, but CJ comes off a flare screen on the opposite side of the floor. So, like, stuff like that where the guy not having the ball, he's doing something. But when you look at the Celtics, it's when Brown has the ball or Tatum has the ball, vice versa. Like when the other player does not have the ball, they don't do anything. Even so, for the other three guys on the court, they don't really do anything. They just stand and stare at the pick and roll on the other side of the floor with Brown or Tatum, right? And so, yeah, it's a huge problem of ball movement. And so, what are your thoughts about Kemba Walker? Like, he's been having some really bad games. I mean,
wait, I had one more comment on that duo. You know what's interesting? Like, you look at who was the duo of the future last year. If you had to name one duo of the future,
yeah, it was Tatum and Brown, right?
no, I had a different one in mind. It would be Luka and Porzingis.
Oh, Luka, yeah, right.
That would be the duo of the future from last year, especially coming out of that series with the Clippers. And then what do you hear at the trade deadline this year? Like, the Mavs are looking around, shopping, seeing what they can get for Porzingis. And yeah, it's a little bit different because Porzingis has been so injury prone. And Brown, I mean, he has knee tendonitis, but he hasn't been injured much in his career throughout. But it's one of those situations where if you're Boston, you've sat gathering prospects for so long that if this window passes after you had all those assets from the worst trade in history from the Brooklyn Nets when they sent you all of their first round picks for 35-year-olds, Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, if you don't win a championship coming off that, it's kind of a waste. And this team doesn't seem close to winning a championship right now, in my opinion. Like, last year, they made the Eastern Conference Finals and they lost to the Heat, but they lost pretty handily to the worst Eastern Conference winner in the past, like, 10 years, in my opinion, because before that, you had the good Heat and the Cavaliers teams who were great. And so that tells you how far you are from actually winning a championship. And if you can get really good value for Jaylen Brown, it's a tough situation because you don't want people to know that you're shopping him outwardly, but you want to check his value because Jason Tatum is probably more your centerpiece than Jaylen Brown. So we'll see how that works out. But to answer your other question about Kemba, I think he'll make a bit of a comeback. Like, you've counted out guys, or not you personally, but people have counted out guys before, like Chris Paul in Houston. Oh yeah, he's done, right? Yeah, he hasn't been done the past couple of years with OKC and then Phoenix, or like just a lot of scenarios. Mike Conley, people thought Mike Conley was finished last year. Gordon Hayward, I mean, people thought he was a complimentary piece, and then he goes to Charlotte, and he's kind of taken a bit of a backseat to LaMelo lately, but he's been awesome there. So give him some time. It's not set in stone yet. He's always been that killer since college when he went on that crazy run, and I still believe in him, although the seeping doubts from Tatum and Brown will negatively affect his game if they continue to think that Kemba's dropping off and they don't want to share the ball with him as much or have him lead the offense. So that's something to watch out for. but I think his skills will translate to success again sometime in the near future for Boston.
Yeah, I think Walker's not really known for his playmaking, and I think that's why people see him as really struggling this season because he's not shooting the ball well. He's struggling offensively and even defensively. He was never a good defensive player. Like you watched him guarding the Raptors last year, like he couldn't guard anybody. And yeah, I don't know. I really think that his injury this year has kind of made it worse for him this year and has been the main reason that he's struggling. But I think if you're Kemba, you got to be dreading for this All-Star break to happen and just kind of take a break, chill out, even for the Celtics as a whole. So I want to talk about one more thing before we end this thing about Boston, but notice how they just let Gordon Hayward walk this past offseason, and they passed up the chance to get Doug McDermott and Miles Turner from the Pacers, and make a trade with that for Hayward. And so what are your thoughts on that kind of what if scenario? What if they had Miles Turner and Doug McDermott? What would this team look like right now?
Well, I think it's an issue with this is one issue I have with Stevens coaching right now. I mean, maybe I'm a little too obsessed on the per 36 stats of Robert Williams, but man, he was shutting down Zion late in that game the other day. He jumps out of the gym. He's a pretty big body inside. He's just a really active player, and he's playing like 15 minutes a game and averaging 1.5 blocks and 1.5 steals. Like that translates to almost 4 and 4 in per 36. And he's been such a difference maker on the floor. So that's where I'm like, okay, even if you had Miles Turner, who's been really, really good this year, he's probably second in Defensive Player of the Year voting so far, or projected voting. I would say Rudy Gobert's first, but he has been so good, and Doug McDermott's been so good coming off the bench. And I think that Indiana would kill to have Gordon Hayward at this point because you see what he's been able to do. And it's sad it didn't work out for both of those teams. Letting Hayward walk was a big mistake. I know they thought they were opening doors for Brown and Tatum, and then all of a sudden Brown and Tatum have Aaron Nesmith beside them for 30 minutes a game instead of Gordon Hayward. And they're like, oh, you're not quite as good as Gordon Hayward. It's like, yeah, this is what happens when you play with lesser players. When you want your role to expand, that means things are going to become more difficult for you because teams are going to have their best perimeter defenders available for both Tatum and Brown every single night, where they used to be able to, they used to kind of split it on whoever's having the hot night. Maybe you put your second best perimeter defender on Hayward instead of Brown that night, and the switching is easier and everything. But it's unfortunate that Boston valued Hayward so little, because it was clear to me as soon as he left that he would be not quite an all-star, but a top 50 player in the league again, and just super efficient as a smart player and plays hard and leads a team well. And clearly Brown and Tatum and Danny Ainge didn't value that. I'm sure Stevens did, but it's a shame for Boston because they let a great player walk.
Yeah. I think when they drafted Nesmith, they probably saw him as that Doug McDermott role, but when you look, like he's barely played in the beginning of the season, and he hasn't even played that much the past few games. But okay, let's end with just kind of this big picture perspective on the Celtics. So they lost 3 straight currently to the Pelicans, and that was one of the worst games ever for them. Like up 24 late in the third, and they blow a lead in OT. And then they go on to lose to Dallas to a heart-wrenching game winner by Luka. And then obviously from those 2 losses, you just get blown out of the water in Atlanta, right? You're just so tired of this stuff. So I think they're just kind of getting through the dog days of the NBA scheduling right before the All-Star break. You're tired. You're just on a slump. You got injured players. Marcus Smart is out for so long. But I think they'll really figure it out after this All-Star break. They have the personnel. They have the coaching. Would have they been better with Turner and McDermott on this team? Probably, of course. But I think learning what Tatum and Brown have been doing the past few seasons, how prolific they are as scorers, they really need to figure out how to move the ball. And you have the right guy in Brad Stevens, but he has to kind of turn from that iso ball mentality to you got to distribute the ball to other guys. But I don't know. It's probably a conflict between, do I really want to iso these guys because we don't really have competent shooters, or do we really want to give competent shooters like Semi Ojeleye, Aaron Neesmith, Daniel Tice like opportunities, Grant Williams opportunities for them to hit open shots. And so I don't know. But when you get into the playoffs, it's a lot of iso ball. There's not too much ball movement. And so yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what he does. But any last thoughts with the Celtics in a big picture perspective?
I think they'll be back into that 4-5 spot. I don't expect them to finish any lower. Anywhere under the third seed in the Eastern Conference is really open right now. And so expect them to return to 4 and 5 seed. But all I'm saying is, big picture, not winning a championship in this era would be failure. So that's where you maybe start to look around at how can you improve this roster. But don't expect them to miss the playoffs or not be in the second round of the playoffs. I don't see long term them struggling to the same degree just because there is so much talent on this roster.
Yeah, and the East is so wide open right now. All it takes is for another hamstring strain for KD to be out in the playoffs and the Celtics to get a few shots more than them, right? And get a few more defensive stops in those scenarios. And yeah, I don't know. The East is wide open, but I think after this season, it's going to be the start of kind of the time bomb when it comes to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum playing together. And this is probably a very, very controversial take. I don't think many people would think this is a popular take because they think, oh, you got two great two-way wings. You need two-way forwards to win in the playoffs, like you saw in Kawhi Leonard and the Raptors and all that, and LeBron James. Like you need these guys, and when you have two guys on the Celtics, that makes you think like, man, this team has really, really good chances to win a championship. You just got to surround them with the right pieces, and I think they do have the right pieces this season. It's just a matter of can you win games? Can you figure out how to win games? And so I don't know. It is very interesting for sure. I don't really know if you have anything else to say, Nate, but
I don't have too much more to add on to the Celtics. But looking forward to this weekend, you have that Dallas and Brooklyn game. That should be exciting. We'll see what Luka can pull off after a hard loss in his last outing to Philadelphia. But hopefully that Dallas resurrection continues to happen because I look forward to seeing them in the playoffs again soon.
yeah, I mean, I just kind of want to wait, or I just kind of want the All-Star break to happen. I think teams are just playing so bad right now. It's like, oh man, I just let the All-Star break happen. I feel like it's really short this season. It's only like a week, and then for the All-Stars, it's only like 2 or 3 days, right? But yeah, it concerns me how there's so many games in the second half of the schedule. It's just so jam-packed, and I feel like they could have reduced it to even 10 games less. But obviously, people would argue that, oh, teams like Dallas or Boston, right, or the Wizards, they need more games to get into that playoff spot. But I don't know. It's such a weird deal with the second half of the season. There's gonna be a lot of load management, I feel like.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many teams crawling to the All-Star break. The Lakers for one of them. Oh, I actually had a funny point earlier. Like LeBron campaigning for Booker to be on the All-Star team. Like, who do you leave off? Maybe he was like, oh, the Jazz aren't that good, and maybe we should leave one of Mitchell or Gobert off the team. Clearly, they proved to him the other night that they are legit. And man, this Jazz team, 22 of 24 games. They lost one tough one to the Clippers, and wow, they're just a buzzsaw. They're killing teams on defense, killing them on offense. I have not seen a team play as well as them in a couple of years, because last regular season Milwaukee was good at times, but they kind of tailed off and had some bad games. So man, the Jazz have looked good lately. And if you want to watch some efficient basketball, go and check out those Jazz games.
I need to buy a Mike Conley jersey, just in support of him. Like, he's been really the X factor of that team. But yeah, I mean, it'll be very interesting second half of the season. The West and the East are actually both wide open in terms of who's going to make the playoffs. The play-in tournament, as usual, was going to be very interesting. I'm looking forward to the All-Star game if people are actually going to try. Are they even going to play basketball? But I think they will. They'll be competitive. But yeah, other than that, that's all we have for you guys today in this edition of The Plunge. Make sure to send us questions if you have any. And yeah, with that, we'll see you in the next episode.